A lot of people will say the trees are dead in the winter. I hear that a lot. The trees are dead. They're not. They're actually very much alive. And they say, well, they're not growing. They are growing. Where they're growing are their roots. And the roots are building up all this capacity. So in the spring, all of that flush of growth is triggered by all that pressure, all that good nutrients and water and storage that they've built up. They push all that new growth out.
So it's a critical moment in Colorado's forests. Years of persistent drought have stressed forests all across the state.
This traditional sawmill to adopt a process that uses radio frequency technology.
Bark of the Douglas fir is dark brown to gray with light brown to red fissures.
First step to managing your forest is to contact a professional forester.
Is that relationship that we as people have with the natural world.
We're sitting around here with a lot of dead and dying timber, which was in the scary state. We're really trying to take a pretty holistic look at the ecology of the area that we're working.
We want interns to feel like they have a really well-rounded experience.
They became a lot more efficient with the tools.
That tree is easily over 100 years old. That tree was removed tomorrow. You and I would never see a tree that big there again. Think about it if you're investing in the future here, not just for yourself, but for everyone.
Welcome to Forest FM, the official podcast of the Colorado State Forest Service at Colorado State University. My name is Matt McCombs, State Forester and Director of the Colorado State Forest Service. Welcome back to Forest FM. Today, we're talking about winter tree care in the urban environment. Here at the Colorado State Forest Service, we not only focus on expansive open forests, the wildland-urban interface, but also serve Colorado as your urban and community forestry experts across the state. Trees may seem quiet and dormant in the winter, but now is the time to think about how to care for them properly so that they can thrive during the growing season. Planting and caring for trees in our backyards and communities requires making the right choices for trees that are well suited for any given environment. It's important that we think well into the future to ensure that our urban and community trees are around for future generations to enjoy, just as we enjoy the efforts of those that came before us. We hope you enjoy this episode. Be sure to explore the resources provided on our website to learn more about urban and community forestry in Colorado.
Welcome back to another episode. My name is Phil Peterson. I'm a forestry communications specialist here at the Colorado State Forest Service. Today we're talking about urban and community forestry during the winter, and our guest today is going to share some insights into what it means for trees to be growing in urban areas, how we can best take care of them, especially if they're on our property, and how we can look into the future to ensure that our urban and community areas have trees that are healthy and will live a long life.
This cottonwood right here is one of my favorite trees in town. My name is Carrie Tomlinson, and I am the new urban forestry manager for the Colorado State Forest Service.
So Carrie, just setting the stage, urban and community forestry. We're talking about trees that grow in developed areas that are, in a lot of ways, their own dynamic ecosystems. And there's a reason why we like having trees where we live. They provide a lot of value to our experiences. So because we live in such close proximity, these trees can blend into the background of our lives. But there is a really important difference between the trees that grow or can grow well in urban and developed areas compared to trees that you might see in more naturalized areas here in Colorado. So can you lay out the differences for us?
So the biggest difference is many of our landscape trees here are not native, and that's actually an okay thing. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But because they're not native and because we've intentionally planted them in an area that naturally doesn't have trees, we have to water them. The watering in the winter, many times we forget about our trees. They become invisible to us in the wintertime. We think about our grass, we think about lights for Christmas, but we don't think about that tree is a living entity that needs to be taken care of.
So trees in urban areas, I mean, what that really comes down to is a lot of concrete and kind of brutal interactions with humans going about their lives, right? So what does that mean for their experiences and ability to grow and thrive in these environments?
Sure. Urban trees have to be extra tough. They are basically given the most tough environments, the most tough impacts, the biggest shifts in temperature differential, the biggest shifts in damage that can happen to them in terms of weed eaters, insects and disease, your neighborhood dog, your neighbor.
Exactly.
There may be a lot of factors at play, but they get a lot of impacts, our urban trees. So because of this, one, they have to be super tough species of trees, but two, they're trees that need extra attention because of that. So if you have a tree that's out in your back 40, along a fence line, along a stream channel, things like that, they will not need to be pruned. They will not need to be watered extra, things like that. But if it's in your yard, those trees do need extra attention. And they need extra protection and extra care. Our trees here in Colorado, because it is an arid environment, definitely have more impacts to them than in other parts of the country. Because of that, we, I think, tend to not think of them a lot of times because we think, oh, they're trees, they grow, they do their own thing. But they need just as much attention and care as your lawn, as your garden, as any kind of outside plants that you have that you'd normally do some extra care for. So our urban trees, like I like to say, they are our superheroes because they provide us all these great benefits: shading, cooling, wind reduction, property value increase, cultural and historical amenities and additions to our neighborhoods, all these great things that they do, air quality increases, I could go on and on and on, stormwater infiltration, all these things that they do. And because of that, we have to actually kind of pay more attention to them, especially in Colorado.
So you mentioned watering as one of the ways to provide care for the trees in your backyard. So I'm thinking it's January, we're in the middle of winter, the temperatures are all over the place, but what does it mean to water your tree? How do you go about doing that in the winter? And what steps can you take to provide that care?
So watering in the winter, how much do you have to water and how do you water? Well, I already turned off my irrigation system, Carrie. What do I do, right? I hear this a lot and I say, there are hose bibs on the outside of your house. And those, as long as you disconnect them and make sure your hose is completely drained before you put it away, those work just fine in the winter. When we're having these really warm, dry, seasonal days, this is a perfect time to water your tree. And what I do, I basically just hook up the hose bib in the afternoon on the weekend, and I will put it next to my tree and just let it drip for, say, half an hour. Especially if it's a smaller tree, you definitely want to keep them watered. Bigger trees have a little more resources, more root area, things like that to draw water from the surrounding areas. But they definitely need water too. So certain trees here, even though they're native, like spruce trees, pine trees, evergreen trees in general, we definitely want to keep them watered in the winter. When it's snowy and we get 12 inches of snow, when it's less than 40 degrees outside, these are times where we don't need to water. The tree's not actively drawing water up from the soil when it's really cold, when it's frozen. But right now, we are abnormally warm and we are abnormally dry, so we definitely need to consider watering.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a pretty manageable way to provide a little bit of water for your trees. So the other thing to talk about would be pruning. And this would be the process of thinking about when and how to remove limbs on your tree as necessary over time. So before we even talk about cutting the limb, why would you want to do that in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in terms of thinking about why you'd want to prune a tree, the number one reason is to train it and to give it the proper structure so that in the future you don't have problems, right? So if you can prune limbs when they're smaller, that might be crossing other limbs or growing into the tree rather than out of the tree, or maybe too narrow, what we call included bark limbs, these are very prone to breakage. So if you can address those things when the limbs are small and do what we call structural pruning, those kinds of efforts will pay off in the end because you've trained the tree to grow in a way that actually is good structure for the tree. That's the number one reason to really prune, and to do it when the tree's younger. You want to kind of be intentional about it, just like you would, say, fertilizing your lawn or mowing your lawn. Like if you're like, okay, it's January, it's time to prune my tree, right? Those kinds of efforts, I think, and being intentional and kind of standing back, taking a good look at the tree, researching the 3-step method to pruning limbs, and doing it in a way that's very intentional is a way better way to do it than that kind of last minute, like, I hate that limb and it's going to die pruning.
Right. So that 3-step method, or the 3-cut method, is a common arborist technique. It's a pretty visual process, so we'll have a diagram in the show notes. But can you just tell us basically what that entails?
You really want to take the weight off of the limb before you do a precision cut. And the precision cut you do shouldn't be into the trunk of the tree. It should be outside of what we call a bark branch ridge. That's that kind of weird looking line that's on a lot of limbs that basically tell you the vascular system of the limb stops and the trunk starts. So you don't want to cut into that. So if you err on the side of leaving a little bit versus cutting into the trunk, that's better. But you want to go under the limb first, outside of that. So you want to go pretty far out from the bark branch ridge, go underneath, cut about 1/3 of the way through the diameter of the limb, come back and cut outside of that. So you're taking the weight, the whole limb off at that point, and you're just working with the stub basically at that point. Then you want to come in, find that bark branch ridge, and make a precision cut outside of it that is going to leave the least amount of surface area that you can when that cut is done. So don't do a diagonal. Diagonal is going to leave a lot of surface area. You want it at a right angle to that limb so that you leave a very little amount of surface area, with the whole idea that that trunk eventually is going to get so big as it gets wider and wider and wider, it will engulf that limb. It will seal it off so that that is not an exposed opening in that tree anymore. That's kind of the basics of a 3-step pruning process. But any of those sharp objects you can do damage to yourself with. So you want to wear gloves. Wearing some eye protection too is a good idea also. I have seen some pretty bad injuries from the smallest limbs that you can imagine getting poked in people's faces. So definitely want to just do those extra steps too. It doesn't hurt.
Yeah, that's a nice overview of how you might go about making those cuts. But the other thing is, at a certain point, it's going to be a little bit too dangerous or risky for you to take on larger limbs that are higher up. So what are your guidelines for when a pruning job might be too much for an individual to take on?
So anything over 10 feet off the ground, really you should be considering professional help. Especially because a lot of our cities and towns have ordinance requirements that if you're working more than 10 feet off the ground, or if your feet are off the ground, especially if you're working on someone else's property, not your own property, you need to be hiring a licensed arborist. And those are found usually by getting on your city's websites and looking for arborist licensing or your list of licensed arborists for your town. These are also good for outside of town. If you have some large trees that are some pruning that needs to be done 10 feet or more off the ground, it's good to get a professional to do that. Not to say you can't do it 10 feet off the ground, but for me, a large limb, say more than, 3 inches in diameter, coming 20 feet straight down and could hit you, that could be deadly. So if you are trimming more than 10 feet off the ground, really consider hiring a professional.
So an arborist is someone who has expertise in tree care and has all of the right certification and experience to be safe and capable to do that. So you had mentioned some reasons why you might need to ask an arborist or check with your city ordinances. As far as safety goes, when do you definitely want to outsource this kind of work?
Hire an arborist if the limb is bigger than, 3 inches, even if it's not 10 feet off the ground. And I'll tell you why. Because 3 inches in diameter limbs are usually very significant limbs for smaller trees. An arborist is going to be able to tell you based on the species and how big that tree is going to get and the structure of that branching on that tree, what is the best way to prune that tree. Sometimes we get snow loading, we get ice storms, we get windstorms that break apart trees. Sometimes that damage is to the point, if it is a significant tree, you maybe purchase that tree for $1,000, $800 from a nursery to have it planted. We definitely want to make sure the structure is sound on those trees, especially if they're going to get 60 feet tall or 50 feet tall over time. So getting just a bit of advice from an arborist to say, hey, I don't think that tree is ever going to fully regain its structure, or I don't think that tree breaking apart like that is going to be sound over time, is a good idea. And then you're not wasting your money or time waiting for that tree to recover when it may not be able to.
So let's say that you've either gotten a consultation from an arborist or it's under that 3 inches in diameter and less than 10 feet off the ground and something very manageable that you can safely prune yourself. So the best time to do that is during the winter. Why is that?
If you prune a tree at the wrong time of year, you are setting it up for failure. Now, that being said, if there's an ice storm, a windstorm, a snowstorm, if that tree is dead, any kind of occurrences like that might happen, that those trees in that situation, pruning the tree becomes paramount for your safety. So you kind of have to weigh those things out. Like if it's a tree that is a fruit tree, but you can wait for the off season when it's dormant, and it's not going to pose a hazard or a danger to you, say you're pulling out of your driveway and you can't see down the street, that might become a more important reason to prune it during the growing season versus, say, if it's just an ornamental tree in your backyard, then you can wait, right? In general, most of your trees do better pruning them when they're dormant. Also, I like to prune when they're dormant because, one, the volume of biomass that you generate when you do that is less because you're only dealing with wood, not just leaves, seeds, wood, everything else. Also, you can see the structure of that tree. You can see the bones of that tree. You can see where there's dead limbs, where there's live limbs, where there's limbs crossing. And when the tree's leafed out, sometimes you can't see those things. But if it's something that you cannot afford in the winter, or if it's something that you definitely need to do for a safety reason, you don't have to wait for the winter to do those things. So use your best common sense, hire an arborist when it's most appropriate, and use their knowledge to determine what is the best possible outcome for your tree and the best time to prune it based on those things.
So we've covered some tree care tips that you want to be engaging in during the winter. And I thought it might be nice to talk more about this idea of trees growing effectively in urban settings and talk about how to select the right tree for your given area.
A great resource usually is going to be your city's website. Many of the forestry divisions and forestry departments in the state of Colorado that are at the city level have recommended species. And if it's in the right-of-way, sometimes they even have rules associated with that. So cottonwoods that fruit are illegal. You cannot plant those in many areas of Colorado. Ash trees are illegal. You cannot plant those. And there's reasons for that, right? The ash trees are susceptible to emerald ash borer, and the cottonwood trees are a huge problem in terms of the cotton that they produce, clogging up filters and being a problem for air conditioners and things, and allergies. So check with your local city authorities. Also, there's a brand new list coming out soon of the recommended species guide for the Front Range and also for Colorado. Should be out, and we'll have it on the Colorado State Forest Service website. Also, I would check with your local nurseries that are specialized in both native and long-term species of trees. There are many, many nurseries here in the state that have been here for a very long time. And if you go to them and say, hey, what kind of tree would you plant in your yard? They'll go, oh, okay, you're asking a good long-term tree question and not the typical, I want something that grows fast question. And you'll get a great answer. A lot of different trees that are great selections that they probably grow themselves here in Colorado. So those are some great options. I would not just go online Google a fast grower, going a lot of times to your major chain stores is not the best way to get a tree. And many times you regret that decision. Some of the top no-nos are silver maple hybrids or maple hybrids that look great in the fall, but are terribly chlorotic most of the year. And if you don't know what that means, it means that bright yellow color. People love them, but they're actually not a good choice for Colorado in terms of a tree. So if you have questions, do a little research. Don't just go to Google and talk to real people about it that are your local resources.
Right. And one of those resources might be like local tree inventories. Can you tell us more about that?
Ooh, that is a great suggestion. So many of our communities, Fort Collins included, I believe Boulder has one, Denver has one. They have most of their public trees inventoried. And what this can do is it can tell you what grows there and what has been successful there and what it looks like. How big does it get? Like, that's the first question people ask is like, how big is this going to get for my yard, right? A good idea is to look at the local tree inventory. Usually they're online. The one here in Fort Collins is on a system called Tree Keeper. You just Google Fort Collins Tree Keeper. It'll bring up the mapping system. If you're walking through a park, you're walking through a downtown area, you can actually pull up the map and look at the tree and know what kind of tree it is, how big it is, the condition it is, even sometimes when it was planted will be on this inventory. And it's a good way to learn your trees, too. You can walk around being an expert and impress all your friends.
Yeah, so it sounds like there are plenty of resources out there to help you think really critically about what's going to be the best tree selection for your given area and how to help it thrive, and then obviously implementing other things like watering and pruning over time to help it succeed. And with all of this, we're really talking about thinking preemptively and thinking into the future to make decisions that are going to help ourselves and the trees and other people enjoy these trees down the line. You know, as we mentioned, we enjoy having trees where we live, and it comes down to some of these individual actions and this responsibility as people contribute to urban forestry in their community.
You know, that idea of the future, I think, is really important. And the wonderful thing, the most interesting thing to me is the areas that have these big shade trees that we see in the historic and the older parts of different towns in Colorado. Those were trees planted 80 years ago, 90 years ago, sometimes 100 years ago. And those people were thinking into the future. Those people planted those trees a lot of times in the 30s, or the turn of the century, things like that. They were imagining those trees when they're 80 feet wide, right? And they put in the big medians, and they put in the big planting spots, and they put them where they knew that they could grow into these giant shade trees. Like, let's think of the tree when you put it in 50 years down the road. Is it going to be a good tree? Because that's what people did before us. So we got to keep that up.
Exactly. I think that's a great mindset to have.
But it's a great example of how a cottonwood can be a good tree in an urban setting if it's maintained and it has a good form to it. So you can see this one's been pruned. You can see pruning cuts on it. And people, I don't think, realize sometimes how old some of these trees are, how long it takes to get them. If that tree was removed tomorrow, you and I would never see a tree that big there again. So
right.
It's important.
So Carrie, thanks for your time. Thanks for lending your expertise. I'm sure this will be helpful to folks as they're staring at their backyard this winter and kind of wondering how to take care of their trees.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. This was fun.
So we'll have links to a bunch of resources in the show notes, and you can go check those out for yourself to learn more. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Forest FM. To learn more about the podcast and the Colorado State Forest Service, please visit our website at csfs.colostate.edu. Take care, and we'll catch you next time.